What I'm going to try and do in the next 25 minutes is give you a summary of the book, so there's no need to get it if you don't want to lose the money. I was lucky enough to get to read The Spirit Level early, and it blew me away. I was trying to find mistakes in it for Richard and Kate, and I couldn't find them, trying to find evidence to suggest that they'd made some mistakes somewhere. For those of you who don't know, The Spirit Level is the book which contains the evidence that people do worse, almost everybody does worse in more unequal societies. And to me, this evidence is pretty convincing. I'm not that interested in debating that evidence. You can't find an unequal society in the rich world, I think, where people are doing particularly well. To me, the interesting question is, why are some countries more unequal than others? How did they get there? And if you think about inequality as being health damaging, The Spirit Level, in a way, provides similar evidence to the smoking evidence in the 1950s that showed us that smoking and lung cancer were correlated. If you believe that inequality is damaging, why are some of us more addicted to it than others? And I think Britain is a particularly addicted country to inequality, along with the United States. In trying to answer these questions, I ended up looking at a lot of work on social evils and what was people say in great big lists is wrong about life in Britain today, and I ended up putting lots of people's lists into boxes and longer lists and smaller lists, and ending up collapsing them into just 5 groups. And these 5 groups relate in a way to the original social evils that William Beveridge and his committee developed in 1942. But in each case, what had been a problem of lack of resources in the 1940s has become a problem of affluence, a problem of having too much and how we deal with it. So I've got 2 slides for each one. I'll show you those pairs of slides and then one conclusion. From here on, the slides will play themselves, by the way. So you can be guaranteed whatever else happens, I will not speak for more than 24 minutes from now. Which is the good news. The other good news is that there's going to be a map here for those of you who like maps. I'm a geographer. I'm not really a sociologist or a political scientist or anybody who knows as much as I ought to about things like inequality, but I know about drawing maps. And so I'm going to just slowly draw you a map, and it's slowly going to change as I'm talking to give you something. You're all looking at it. Maps are great, aren't they? You see, you're all looking at it. It's going to slowly change as we talk. Okay, 5 original evils, each changing, I would argue, to 5 new great problems. The thing about a social evil is it must be something that's common and must be something that's almost accepted in society as normal and something we just can't get rid of. And in a way, here's the first one, ignorance under Beveridge. Ignorance, large proportion of the population being unable to read and write and so on. In the 20s and 30s, I think many people accepted that as just normality. And that change to think we need to provide free secondary education for all with the 1944 Act was a change in core beliefs. I've been very convinced by James Flynn's book, The Flynn Effect, which says that we have become, in some ways, much cleverer. My parents in the audience, I have to be careful about this. But it's the first time I've actually done talk with my parents in the audience and realised I'm about to make this point. What James Flynn argues is that because of the way society has changed and because of the way, compared to I would say my grandparents and their parents, the way you had different tasks and different things to do, our ability to cope with abstract thoughts and logic and so on is so much greater now than it was. We have become cleverer in some ways, in some logical ways. And people often want to argue the opposite. And so if you look at young people today and what they can do, it is quite amazing compared to my grandparents' generation. My granddad was at school, I think, around about 1921, 22, something like that. However, when you look at what the OECD say about our children now, this is in the PISA study of 2006, they describe a 1/7 of children or more in Britain as being almost delinquent in their inability to do things. And the question is, how did we end up with this? Well, the PISA study on education isn't run by educationalists or teachers. It's run by economists. And in 2009, it was revealed, when they finally published a technical report of the PISA study on how children do in different countries, that the economists had decided to fit the data to a bell curve. And hence, And I've got the bell curves, I've drawn them in my book. Hence, the economists think that children's ability is distributed like that and decided that 1/7 really were very, very simple. I'll summarise my points now about elitism in Britain. We think where we live is normal. It isn't normal. The country which spends the most on private education in the world is Chile. The country which spends the next highest proportion of its education budget on private education is the United Kingdom. About a quarter of our spending on just 7% of children. After that, we segregate another 20% into church and grammar schools and so on. We then have about 57 varieties of what used to be comprehensives. We have enormous angst about where our children are going to school, incredibly divided. And as university expansion has increased and postgraduate expansion has increased, we've spent more and more money giving more and more qualifications to those who start off with the most qualifications, while still in the town that I grew up in, 1 in 10 children leave school with no qualifications. And the town I grew up in, the town in which children do worse at school if they go to a state school after Liverpool and Hull, provides one of the worst education environments in Britain. It's a black spot in terms of getting to university. You should be able to guess, I might have a tiny bit of an accent left. Any guesses? Not Kent? Not Nottingham? No, and we don't know it. This is part of my point. Not Peterborough. I grew up in Oxford. The 5 state comprehensives of Oxford send hardly any children to the University of Oxford and a tiny number to Oxford Brookes. Why? Because Oxford is full of private schools. The left-wing, Guardian-reading academics of Oxford are now frightened to send their children to the poshest of the comprehensives. This is a mess. They could have it. They could take it over, but they can't organise themselves to all send their children to the school at the same time. It's a very sad country to live in that sense. And if you compare it to France and Germany, it's not right. I've got behind myself already. He sees an advantage on the slides moving forward. You'll notice here, by the way, we've slowly been drawing the motorway network and the river network. And if you look carefully, the map is going to change, but it's going to change slowly and gradually. Want. People not having enough money, people going hungry and so on. That's completely altered. We tend not to go hungry now. There are people who find it, a large number of people who find it hard to heat their homes. But in the past, the middle class couldn't heat their homes either. The difference now is that we're excluding huge numbers of people because we've moved what is normal so far forward and we've stretched things out. So the poor now eat too much rather than eating too little. At the very least, 1/6 of people are excluded from the norms of society, even using the strictest definitions of being socially excluded. That's 1 in 6 households. And a much smaller proportion are able to exclude themselves by dint of their wealth. These proportions are higher in London. To be normal now in London is not to be normal, if you see what I mean. London contains a very high number of very poor people in Europe and a very high number of very rich people, and very few in the middle. Although most of the rich people don't think they're rich because they're comparing themselves to other people who are a little bit richer and so on and so on and so on. Society has changed. John Hills has shown it over time. It's a bit like an onion where the top's been stretched and the super rich have zoomed off. But if you cut the top off, it's the same shape. And if you cut the top off again, it's the same shape. It's fractal. So inequality above us, the people just above us have moved away and we all tend to feel poorer. And this creates all kinds of problems in society. As you've seen from the leaders' debates and the way the election is progressing, although they'll talk a little bit about fairness, they don't really want to talk about what fairness is. And certainly talking about the cheapest and most efficient way to reduce inequalities, which is to bring down income and wealth at the top a little bit, where it's excessive. It's the opposite. It doesn't cost you money. It makes you money. That is a taboo. It's very tricky ground to go on. And it's much more of a taboo in unequal countries than in equal countries. In the United States, if you talk about death taxes, the vast majority of the population have been taught to oppose them. I'll give you one more example about the United States before getting on to idleness. But just to try and show you how strange people's way of thinking is, I recently saw a proposal from a town in Texas where the local planners were trying to propose to build a pavement along the main street of the town. And there was objection to it, and the proposal was turned down because building a pavement was seen as the steady beginnings of a road towards socialism. Because you want people to take responsibility for themselves and to get their own cars and to drive. You don't want to be doing things for people. Now, we can see that as stupid. And when you see the Tea Party people talking about how you don't want socialised medicine, we know that they're misguided. What I'd like you to think about is that if you take the 25 richest countries on the planet, after the USA, Singapore, which is tiny and unusual, and Portugal, which is not quite so tiny but also unusual, the United Kingdom is the fourth most unequal. There are 21 other OECD countries which are more equal in income distribution than us, including Israel. And that's excluding the West Bank and Gaza. But yeah, including Israel, Israel's more equal than we are. We say and believe things that to most people in the rich world will sound as stupid as you shouldn't build pavements. That's a slippery road towards communism. And we won't recognize it because we're used to it. Idleness has been zooming away here. Here we go. Idleness was the old problem of mass unemployment. And you might think, well, that one stayed the same, hasn't it? But it's different. I mentioned my granddad earlier. I was talking to my granddad, he's luckily still alive, about what happened in 1929 and 1930. And one thing that was interesting is his facial expression changed at that point. And he suddenly had a slight look of fear in his face I'd never seen before. And if you do talk to people who can remember that depression, it's interesting to watch what they say. And I said, well, how bad was youth unemployment? He said, oh, there wasn't any. I said, what do you mean there wasn't any youth unemployment? He said, oh, no, young people could get jobs. There was no minimum wage. They were working. It was skilled men who needed a wage for the family. They were not employed. That was the problem of the 1930s. So I went to check, because I don't always believe my granddad. And it's in the 1931 census. You can see it there. There wasn't enough money to employ everybody after the crash in 1929. There is enough money now, easily. Almost 1 million young people under 25 unemployed. It costs very little to give them all a job, except that we are spending that money on wages at the top in a way we never have done before. You can take a single banker's bonus of £1 million and then work out how many JSA plus £15 a week conservation volunteers you get for that one banker's bonus. A tiny reduction in income inequality gets you to full employment. And what's full employment? Full employment, and I had to ask Richard about this because I never know it. Full employment is the 1960s and 70s whereby if you didn't like your job, you could tell your boss to shove it and go and get another one. Now, I'm a university professor in the Russell Group University, which tends not to sack anybody, has tended not to sack anybody, and we're looking at £1 billion of cuts. So if I don't like my job, can I tell my boss to shove it and get another job in another university in this country at the moment? First they come for the labourers. You see the way it kind of goes up? Real freedom is being able to tell your boss to shove it and go for another job. I was talking yesterday to somebody from a supermarket, I won't name because I don't want to be taken to court, about the volcano. And I said, what are you talking about the volcano? And he said, oh, we're talking about when we're going to cut our workers' wages if they've been on holiday and they can't get back to work. I said, you what? He said, oh, yes. This is shop floor workers in this supermarket who will not be being paid now, and of course they've got to pay their rent and they're stuck out in Malaga or somewhere. I said, well, won't they just, you wouldn't want to work for a company like that. And he just smiled and he went, they haven't got a choice because there aren't any jobs. Right? It's not freedom. And it's a form of prejudice we have now where we do look down on shop workers and just go, well, they're not like us. I'm sure the bosses of these companies aren't not getting paid because they're stuck out wherever they are on holiday. In fact, it's very interesting to look at who is on holiday right now, but I won't upset anybody about that. But it's a certain distribution of who can still afford to fly. Squalor. Squalor was the fourth of Beveridge's great evils. It was the problem of no inside toilets, no running water, no heating, slum clearance. All that's gone, largely gone. In some estates, we've rebuilt 3 times since 1942. The worst housing situations are now in the private sector. So have we sorted out our housing? Can you imagine telling William Beveridge how many millions and trillions and billions we're going to spend on housing? And he'd say, oh, that's great, you've sorted out your housing. If you said we've got 120 million bedrooms and only 60 million people, and we're managing to spend half our income on housing, why? Because we're paying to live away from other people. It's called location, location, location. It's all about not living near the estate. When the nice people on the telly program talk about it, they talk about, oh, look at the neighbourhood, the decor. And what the neighbourhood and the decor means is the council estate is 3 miles away, so the local school might be a bit like a private school. You couldn't have told people involved in slum clearance that housing would change to be this thing you had to spend as much as you could on, because otherwise your children might have to mix with those children who are much less like your children than in the past. It's a problem of affluence. The majority of children in households without cars have only one parent. These are the families that need a car, when you've only got one mum and no dad. But that's the most likely ones not to have one. 1 in 7 single people have 2 cars. You can only drive 1 car at once. Right? One problem with growing inequalities of wealth and income is you end up with these ridiculous situations in which you're giving people who've got most more and more and more and more, and they just simply can't spend it and do things with it. I'm now getting ahead of myself. The last one is going to be disease. And they're all examples of trying to say what goes wrong as you have inequality widening, as we've had in this country since around about at least 1978, and has happened in the United States, and has not happened to this extent in almost anywhere else in the rich world. What goes wrong? And the worst thing that goes wrong is that your thinking gets mucked up, your politics gets mucked up, your national debates become mucked up. Disease, the great fear in 1942, the fear that you might have to call a doctor because you couldn't pay the doctor if your child was ill. We solved it by creating a national health service in just 3 years. And we created a national health service in 3 years because we were bankrupt and because the middle class couldn't afford to pay the doctor either. There are sometimes advantages to going bankrupt as a country. You do things you wouldn't have thought of doing before. The NHS was very, very cheap. And the NHS has largely worked. The people it's worked for least are now appearing on the map. I should have said, I've slowly changed the map. It's now a map drawn by population. So we are here in the middle of London. This is London. This is the areas which have had the lowest increase in life expectancy in the since 1997. And they're actually the areas that voted Labour. The gap between Conservative and Labour voting areas has widened, and the current widening is accelerating. Life expectancy down here in Kensington and Chelsea, little dot, there we go. Not many Labour voters in Kensington and Chelsea. Last year went up by more than a year in 1 year. For life expectancy to go up by more than a year, if that continues for any length of time, those people become immortal. Right? The brilliant news, Richard and Kate often say that the times are changing and may be coming to a change. The brilliant news of coming to a year is you know they have to change. And it's evidence that now is odd, now is strange. You are not living in a normal place at a normal time. It's just that like frogs in a kettle being heated up, you've become used to this. Kensington and Chelsea. Oh, here we go, down here. You have to guess what these people are. House prices, they went up last year. They didn't just go up. In some parts, they went up by an average of £200,000 a flat, whereas in most of the rest of the country, house prices are going down. Flat used to cost about £500,000, now cost about £700,000, 2 beds, very nice stucco on the outside. And the reason why is because the flats became cheaper. I'm thinking, how did they become cheaper? They became cheaper because if you're sitting in Russia or in the States and you're looking at buying a flat in London, the pound dropped, and suddenly it's much more of a bargain if you're part of the world's super rich to buy in Kensington and Chelsea. Right? And you've got this going on at the same time as the recession is hitting other parts of the country. If you ever wanted to know exactly, precisely where the bankers live, This is a precise map. The interesting thing about the map, and it's in effect where the bailout has helped people most directly. This is Canary Wharf. It's not that big in terms of bankers, looks big, but that's the commercial side. This is the hedge fund concentration. And you don't know about it because you have these tiny little copper plaques because you're not allowed to advertise a hedge fund, and even if you could, why would you? Because you need £1 million starter to join a hedge fund. And this is the kind of Covent Garden, where we're near Bond Street, Mayfair area of banking. Edinburgh was helped out by the bailout. Tiny bit of helping at Leeds and Bristol, but not very much. And it's in these areas which have seen the biggest improvements in standards of living since 1997. Life expectancy, education results, house prices. And that wasn't the plan. It wasn't the plan of a Labour government. But another example of when things go badly, badly wrong is that you have a Labour government in power for this length of time, and you watch social inequalities in this way just move apart. So we're living in very strange times and places. To conclude, I mentioned the 25 richest countries in the world earlier. Here's the top 5 and the bottom 5. Singapore, the United States, Portugal, and there's Israel. The figure in brackets after them, the figure before them, is the ratio between the average income of the best off tenth and the worst off tenth. So in the United Kingdom, the best off tenth, every day, every hour, gets about 13, almost 14 times more than the worst off tenth, as opposed to somewhere like Norway, where it's 6 times as much. The figure afterwards in brackets is the new measure of illiteracy, using a much stricter measure than in the past, but of how many people, if you met them, you would say, actually, that person really is functionally illiterate, they can barely read and write. Most of those countries in the top 5 don't actually manage to record it, but the United States and UK, you're looking at 1 in 5 of the population have functional illiteracy, whereas in the most equal countries in the world, in the rich world, it's half that much. In Japan, it's not that it records it. In Japan, there is almost no point in recording functional illiteracy. It is so rare. I'll end with one little story about Japan, and then I will stop. Because we often talk about Scandinavia as a model of how we could do better in Britain. I think it's interesting to look at Japan also. Very different model of how you have a society which is more equal, but a society which has coped with about almost 15 years worth of recession now, and things aren't coming to an end. It's not self-destructing in Japan. I've interviewed people in various countries of the world about inequality, and I've asked them basic questions. I've tried to ask them what they think the average wage in their country is, what they think the poorest get, what they think the richest get. And in general, I've avoided interviewing people who are too young because they tend to find talking about a distribution tricky. In Japan, I interviewed a young man, about 18 years old, with a translator, in one of the poorest areas of Japan, and started doing this, and was shocked to find that he could cope with the idea of quintiles. He could cope with the idea of distributions, and he got the figures correct for his country. Because in Japan, everybody is educated up to the age of 18, and everybody can take part in the national debate. And there isn't a large group of people who think they are that much more superior to other people, who in fact don't know as much as people in most of the rest of the world do. It's hard to be told that there's something wrong in your country. It's hard to be told that Britain has half the credit card debt of Western Europe, and that is because something went badly wrong here, but it has gone badly wrong here. It needs to be addressed, and the most difficult thing about addressing it is that we have become used to it, and used to it to the extent that we've begun to defend inequality, to talk about elitism as good, to talk about other people as being feckless and underserving, to talk about mental illness as just being an inevitable outcome of the way we live now, to say it's just a result of globalization, to look always to America rather than to look to Europe and to despair about it. I think it's possible to change. I think that life expectancy going up more than a year in Kensington tells you that we're back to where we were at the start of the 1920s, in the Great Gatsby age, when the rich were behaving completely irresponsibly. After that, we had 40 to 50 years of, on average, the next year being more equal than the year before. There is no reason why we couldn't have 40 or 50 years now of next year being slightly more equal than this year. But you have to argue for it. You don't get given it on the plate. Thank you.
Richard Wilkinson and I set out to write our book, The Spirit Level, we had quite definite ideas about what we wanted to do. We knew we'd got a large body of evidence that showed that income inequality was bad. It was bad for population health, it was bad for a whole range of social problems, it was consistently bad whether we looked at the rich countries or the 50 US states, it was bad whether we chose our own problems or whether we chose an index of problems that someone else had developed. We knew what we wanted to say. And we thought we needed to write a book that was legible, intelligible, clear to a general audience, because nobody reads academic papers. Most academics don't read many academic papers. They very rarely cite them when they're writing their own things. They don't really think about them. So we knew we needed to do something different. We needed to get these ideas out. And we thought, when we started, that if we could just give that evidence, if we could just put it out there and show the damage that inequality did, then change would flow from that. We were optimistic, we were idealistic maybe, we were naive possibly. But as we wrote our book and as it was published, it coincided with the credit crunch and the global recession, and it has coincided with the publication of other evidence. The government's commissioned report on inequalities in Britain, authored by John Hills at the London School of Economics, Michael Marmot's review on health inequalities, Danny's book. There are many other studies. The world is starting to be filled with empirical evidence that inequality is damaging. And since we published our book, we've actually been surprised that across the political spectrum, politicians have expressed support for the notion that inequality in Britain has got too big and inequality is damaging. We've heard that from key thinkers in the Conservative Party. David Cameron, in his Hugo Young lecture on poverty, talked about how damaging the impact of inequality is. We've heard it from the Liberal Democrats, we've heard it from the Labour Party, we've heard it from the Greens. But from the three main parties, and I'm really sorry that maybe tonight you're not at home watching the debate of our candidates for Prime Minister. I hope you're all going to watch it later on iPlayer or some other venue. That none of the three main parties are committing to serious policies that will actually reduce inequalities. The most they are doing is talking about raising the bottom, perhaps raising minimum incomes, perhaps introducing a minimum income for healthy living. But they won't talk about constraining incomes at the top. They won't talk about the runaway salaries and the bonus culture. And so we are in a strange situation where we have a robust, scientifically sound, evidence-based that inequality damages all of us, and that we in the UK, all of us in the UK, all of us sitting here tonight, are damaged by the effects of inequality, and yet we are not pushing our politicians to do more, and they are not responding to the evidence. Danny's book is a powerful and really eloquent argument as to why we're in this strange situation. He talks about 5 ideas, 5 ideologies, 5 beliefs that actually we all hold and that enable us to permit this injustice to continue. He talks about elitism. And when I read his work on elitism, I found myself questioning my own beliefs. Do I, when I'm looking at applications from students to the University of York, do I actually believe they're all capable of learning throughout their lives, all capable of getting a PhD, all having their own individual abilities to learn, to do different things? I question that in myself. And our evidence on the impact of income inequality on social mobility and educational performance suggests that in the UK, we do not collectively believe in the abilities of all of our children. Danny writes about exclusion. And I would challenge all of you to ask yourselves, do you think the poor, those who smoke, people who are fat, actually are poor, smokers, or fat because they're lazy, feckless, reckless, don't try hard? What do you yourselves actually think about people who do not behave in ways that we consider appropriate? Our evidence on the effect of income inequality on the abuse of drugs and on obesity suggests that more unequal societies have higher levels of those. They're not to do with individual behaviours. They are structured by the inequality within society. So question your beliefs on those things. I also wonder how we all think collectively about low-paid workers. Do they deserve not to earn much more because they're not doing anything very useful? How do we all think about migrants? They come into this country and they expect to have all kinds of benefits. How do we think about people in different ethnic groups? Are they just not complying with our social norms? Are they just not behaving in ways we expect them to? The evidence suggests that actually migrants are healthier than the rest of us. The evidence suggests that ethnic minorities are not responsible for inequalities in health that we see across the whole distribution. And the evidence suggests that low-paid workers actually are not lazy, feckless. Most people want to work. Most people will work hard. And all jobs in our society deserve a healthy, not a minimum wage, but a decent wage. We need to value people who care for those who are sick. We need to value those who tidy up after the rest of us. We need to value a whole range of contributions to our society, and not just those who make money out of nothing. And when we think about greed, let's think about how we used to view the bankers. When the Fabians started to do research on people's attitudes to inequality in Britain, they started before the credit crunch. And they found that people in focus groups thought that bankers or high salary earners probably deserved their incomes because they must be cleverer than us. They must deserve more. And then as the credit crunch started to hit, people changed their views. And they started to realize that actually those people who were earning those massively high salaries aren't cleverer than us. They haven't done anything useful. They've brought us to the brink of disaster, and most of them are woefully unqualified to work in the industries in which they are employed. We know that income inequality increases the number of hours that people work in different societies, and we know that it increases their level of personal debt. If you live in a more unequal society, money matters more, status matters more, so you go all out to achieve those markers of success. And that is a very dysfunctional goal for us as a society, to just want to buy more and more, to just want to achieve more and more and express our superiority in relation to others. And lastly, Danny talks about despair. We've had a worrying trend in the countries that have become more unequal over the past few decades, a trend of positive psychology and fostering self-esteem, trying to tell those who achieve a lot that they're special and superior, and therefore excluding those who cannot manage to cope with those conditions, that they do not belong, that they are not worthy. We know that in more unequal countries, more people are mentally ill. They suffer more depression, more anxiety, more psychotic diseases. In the UK, the last time a population-based survey of mental illness was done, 23% of us were mentally ill in the past year. That's about rest of you. In the US, 26%, maybe about there. But in more equal countries, it's fewer than 1 in 10. Our levels of health and social problems are not an inevitable consequence of living in an affluent society. They are an inevitable consequence of living in an unequal society. So what can be done about it? Hundreds and hundreds of things. Almost everything a government does has an impact on the income distribution of its society. Governments can put more progressive taxation into place, they can redistribute more, they can increase benefits, they can raise minimum wage. They could, as many of us are asking them to, demand a commission to look at high pay as well as low pay. But also, we can all advocate for more forms of democracy in our institutions where salaries are set. We can all support cooperatives, mutual societies, employee-owned companies, companies that give shares to their employees. We can all make a difference. We can all demand transparency in our own institutions. We can all speak to our parliamentary candidates coming up to the next election and say, will you commit to a more equal Britain, and how will your party actually make a change? We need to communicate the damages of inequality with hard empirical evidence, and so many people are doing that now. We have done it in our book, Danny is doing it in his book, I've mentioned a number of reports that also express that, but we need to, as citizens, provoke, irritate, push, question those who make decisions for the rest of us on policies that actually affect inequality. The spirit level shows that inequality is important. And Danny shows us so eloquently what ideas we all hold, what ideas we've all bought into that uphold the status quo. I really plead with you to read his book and to challenge yourselves and to think constantly, what do I do that maintains inequality? What could I do that would push for greater equality? And really go for it, because we've got an opportunity now. We've got a public space. We've got an opportunity for discourse. We've got an election coming up. We've got politicians who are at least paying lip service to the idea that inequality is damaging. We've got a chance for change. So let's grasp it with both hands and do everything we absolutely can to turn that into a real change for Britain. We used to be more equal. We can be more equal again. We are not a fixed culture of inequality. Britain used to be more equal. It used to be a better place to live. So let's work to make it so again.
Can I just start off by asking about, and I don't do this in any kind of partisan way because I have no idea what your conclusion is going to be. What is your view of Labour's record in this regard? Because my understanding is that Labour's tax benefit reforms and Labour's public spending has been highly redistributive, highly redistributive. It's basically taken all together, not really added anything to the wealth of the top 10% and added a great deal to the wealth of the bottom 10%, and it's a fairly straight line between the two. But that hasn't taken much out of inequality as a whole. So I suppose the question I've got for both of you, and I'll start with you, Danny, is how should we understand that record, and what should we learn from it, and why is it that so much activity by the state in tax and benefit and public spending has had so little impact on the overall picture? Maybe choose a bit of that or whatever. But.
Yeah. It was a lot, but it is the first Labour or Liberal government in the last 100 years to see inequalities in health and wealth rise under it. And the problem is it was a lot, but it wasn't enough. So at the same time as tax credits were coming in, the minimum wage came in and so on, the market was being allowed to increase inequalities in pay such that it didn't just cancel out absolutely everything the government did in aggregate effect, but went slightly further. Now, it may sound trivial, But in 1997, the income inequality between the top and bottom fifth by one recent estimate was 6.9 to 1. And by 2000 and end of 2008, the latest figure we've got, it was 7.1 to 1. Now you're thinking 6.9 to 7.1, it got bigger, it got worse. But it's only 6.9 to 7.1. It's 1/5 of the way to becoming the United States in terms of how far we are from the States in terms of inequality. And so, although the government did a lot, and you can imagine a different government in 1997 making things much more unequal and us becoming worse than Singapore, you know, a nightmare scenario, if you like, they didn't do enough, not just to stop inequalities widening, but actually they carried on widening. And here's the most important thing about this. Income inequalities got to this very high level, and then in effect, Labour kept them there. Slight narrowing with those budgets of 2001, 2 and 3, and then widening again. What you get when you have really high income inequalities is an acceleration in wealth inequality. Because if you are earning twice as much as you can save a little bit. You can't. And that's year after year after year. And that's why, and the John Hills report has this number in, and they didn't report it because they thought nobody would believe it. It's the last appendix of the John Hills report. In London, the best off tenth of Londoners have each access through pensions and houses and so on to an average of almost £1 million worth of wealth. The worst off tenth of Londoners, £3,000. The gap is 273 times. And when you have 1/10 of the population holding 273 times the wealth of another tenth of the population, you aren't really talking about the same species anymore. Do you let your children mix with those children? What happens if they marry them? What do you do? And I can't find, I've been trying to find, a figure anywhere near that big for a tenth versus a tenth. And it's just London. I can't find it anywhere other than the city at the time of slavery in the United States.
Okay, do you want to comment on Labour's record?
I mean, I think the main problem is, and I think we've already referred to it, that when Labour came in, they decided to focus their attentions on the bottom and helping the bottom. And they have undoubtedly put in place measures that have reduced child poverty and pensioner poverty. But as we know, they were famously relaxed about people getting super rich. They didn't think that that growing inequality, that growing runaway top income band mattered. That's possibly because they simply were not aware of the evidence for that. They are now, and so they need to be held to account for their future policies. They have done something to sort of hold the line on inequality, and inequalities would be a lot worse had New Labour not put in place certain policies. But now the evidence is so compelling that the gap matters and that we can't be relaxed about the super rich. We do need to worry about the top as well as the bottom. So going forward, we need to ask serious questions of all the political parties about what they will do to constrain those top incomes.
Okay, two more quick questions, and I want to bring people in. We had a lecture by here a while ago by Stein Ringen, the Scandinavian sociologist based at Oxford, I think. And he wrote a little pamphlet called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Brown. I don't know if you've read it. But he explores why it is that, given the advantages that New Labour inherited in 1997, it made as little progress as it did. And his answer is a failure of mobilisation. So he says that Labour made the task of overcoming child poverty or reducing inequality a technocratic proposition, which they were going to carry out through kind of complex mechanisms like child tax reforms. Although those were important, they didn't really explain this as something which was actually something which the nation had to be committed to and that would involve us all in some way. Just briefly, where have you seen, I mean, you made an impassioned plea, Kate, for us all to kind of get off our backsides and do something about this. Where, and Danny, you talked about these differences between Japan and Scandinavia and Britain. Where have we seen a successful public mobilization in favor of greater equality? Is it simply that the Japanese and the Swedes over hundreds of years as a consequence of religious and cultural traditions have ended up like this and that we can never be like them because we're not like them? You know, can you give us some hope, whether it's a city level or a national level, of where it is that politicians have provided the leadership and you want, and citizens have followed it?
If you want one book to read on this, I'd read Jane Kelsey's The New Zealand Experiment. It was actually published in 1997, and the tragedy was that nobody read it in 1997, and it was about what happened to New Zealand when they did neoliberalise and so on. And the most telling thing in her book is that she says the very nature of understanding and political belief was changed in New Zealand, so that middle-of-the-road and left-wing parties moved to begin to believe right-wing orthodoxy. And the same occurred in the United States under Clinton, and Noam Chomsky's written about that. It's not that there's something special about Japan or Scandinavia, it's that something strange and unusual happened to us and New Zealand in a little way and the United States in another way. You can read the manifestos of the political parties in Sweden and read phrases about wanting to look after everybody and we're all in it together, meaning it. You read it and you realize that they actually do mean it. And then you suddenly think, well, why are they saying that to us? I think Kate might talk about Japan and where it was. But this is the thing that most worries me. What really happened in the late 70s and the 1980s that was damaging wasn't that widening income inequality, although that was very bad. Something changed in what we came to believe about people with that loads of money culture and believe about individuals and ourselves, and it actually rotted the social fabric of thinking. In the same way that you can see so easily often looking at attitudes in the United States, you think, how on earth can they think that? And you know they didn't think it in the 60s and 70s. Getting back from that's going to be hard. The three main parties are very similar. All three are very similar over public sector cuts. I can just about remember 1978, 79, 1980. And you'll be able to tell in the next few months, but they all seem to be saying, we want, and there is no alternative to massive cuts. And I think the fact that all three of them are saying that is a result of that intellectual and public policy rot that set in, which we've seen before a long time ago in Britain, but it's going to take a lot more work than simply showing some graphs and saying, look, you don't want to do it like this, because people have...
Unfortunately, it usually seems to take a war. That's my slight worry. I mean, is there anything other than the discovery that half of the soldiers weren't fit for the Boer War or the Second World War that's going to change our social, which is going to, turn this round?
Yeah, Matthew, you're right that often in the past countries have become more equal because of an external threat like war, where governments have wanted to foster the cooperation and collaboration of their citizenry. It hasn't always been to do with explicit war. It's sometimes been to do with an external threat such as communism or an external economic threat locally. But I think that actually what we're all facing, or most governments of rich countries will be facing in the next couple of decades, is the threat, the external threat of having to deal with climate change. And that actually offers us a possibility of creating more equal societies, because more equal societies actually are better placed to cope with climate change. They have less status competition, so they're less consumerist. They are less individualistic, so they're more likely to act for the collective good. They recycle more, they are more peaceful and less aggressive. They donate more in foreign aid. And they're also more innovative, so they're better placed to come up with technological solutions for climate change. So we might actually be at a point where not only the global recession and the credit crunch is forcing us to rethink our ideas about inequality, because we've seen how damaging greed is for our society, but we're also having to re-examine what we want our society to look like as we cope with climate change. And I think what we're looking for in our politicians and what we're not getting from our mainstream parties is a really compelling vision of a good, sustainable society where we will all have a better quality of life because we have more equality.